Imagine this, taking an exciting sailboat ride followed up by a relaxing drink in a tiki bar. Your view is peaceful boats moored where their reflections glimmer in the still ocean water. You snap a photo, trying to capture the moment. It's beautiful enough for a painting. How do you transform it into a watercolor? In this video, I'll show the steps to use a photo as a reference and make strategic changes that bring art into the composition. Starting with the drawing, I'm laying in clean water to be ready to put in the pigment for the sky. This will be wet and wet. This is the first departure from the photo. I decided to make it an afternoon view so that we could capture the dying rays of the sun in the clouds. Using cobalt blue and purple, I'm starting to put in the deeper pigments in the clouds farthest from the sun. I'm using a chip brush, and you can see it in the description and in the ending credits. The chip brush bristles are made uneven, and that really helps to make random marks. As I progress towards the sun side, I'm painting lighter and lighter colors. I wanted to have fairly straight masks in the painting, and in the past when I've tried to do straight masks, my hand always wiggles and trembles, and I can never get a straight line. Years ago, I learned a trick from John Salmonen in a workshop he gave, where you can place masking tape on the paper and then using an X-Acto knife cut out the shapes that you want. It's like masking fluid for straight edges. Sometimes exact straight edges really work well in a composition. Other times, like when we use a ruler, the painting will end up looking stiff. In this particular case, I cut the tape by guiding the knife with the ruler. I've started to paint in the foliage using a combination of shadow green, undersea green, and Serpentine Genuine. This is wet and wet, starting with clean water. As I work in the foliage, I need to become more precise, so I switched to the Princeton Neptune brush, which holds a lot of pigment and also allows you to get to a very fine point. Notice how I'm cutting around the shapes of the boats and the posts. This is an example of negative painting. Proceeding onto the water, the sky is still wet. The foliage is still wet, and I'm trying to blend the color of the sky into the water. I start off by dropping in some cobalt blue. I've also started to add the initial shadows on the boats. After that, I added a little bit of Manganese Blue Hue to the water. I'm working very wet at this point. I'm leaving some white for the reflections of the mass and continue to drop in blue. If you have any questions about doing this painting, leave me a comment. Now I'm starting to add in the sky color into the water, starting with Dioxazine Violet. You can see I'm dropping in yellow and red to get orange and tilting the board to get the colors to blend. I'm working more on the shadows of the boats. I'm using a little bit of turquoise and then switching to work a little bit more on the reflections. You'll see that I've changed the shape of the buildings a little bit, where I shortened the height of the foliage so it doesn't cover the buildings as much. This is another departure from the photo. I thought that would add a little bit of interest to show the buildings behind the trees. The brush I'm using is a Robert Simmons flat synthetic brush. By this point, the painting has dried, and I'm starting to lay darker and darker values all over the painting, starting with the foliage using an Escoda Liner No. 6. Note the distant shapes of palm trees. Even though I'm layering, I can still work wet into wet by dropping darker color onto the medium value color that I put in for the foliage. I continue on with cutting in the shapes of the boats with the brush. These dark values will really start to give a 3D feel of the boats. And again, with negative painting, I'm leaving the shapes of the posts that I'll come back later to fill in. On the right-hand side, there's a fair amount of detail in the photo which is near the boats by the docks. There's equipment that's near the buildings, and I wanted to suggest that without a lot of detail, and initially thought I wanted pretty bright reflections of these posts, but as you can see, I started to paint over those posts. Now I'm putting in the distant docks on the left side of the composition. You'll note that one other thing that I changed from the photo is that there are two foreground docks, one on the left-hand side and one that starts on the bottom middle and goes to the left-hand corner of the photo. I've left out the left side dock. I didn't think that it helped the composition, but I do think that the lower dock does help bring the viewer into the painting and point to the subject, which is the boats and their reflections. Continuing on, I've started to add the color to the docks and posts using burnt sienna. I'm adding more value in the shadows between the boats, mostly using shadow green, and then working those shadows down into the water with the reflective colors of the foliage. Again, working wet into wet, I've put even more reflections of the sailboat shadows in the water. In this part of the painting, I'm deepening the values, continuing to add emphasis on details for the shapes of the boats and the buildings. And by this point, because I'm doing some detailed work, I've switched to the Nico No. 9 brush. Continuing on, I'm adding even more details to the boats, adding in the shadows, reflections of the posts in the water, and additional details and shadows on the boats and the buildings. This particular scene was something that I shared with my husband and parents many years ago when they were vacationing in a place called Englewood, Florida. And in fact, we did go to the tiki bar. We didn't take a sailboat ride that day. That video was from a later trip to Newport, Rhode Island. But we actually did sit in little straw-covered tables, had drinks and dinner. We watched the sunset and it was really lovely. It's a very fond memory for me with my husband and my parents. How many of you have visited Florida? I bet a lot of you. Have you ever seen the area around Englewood, Florida? I would be interested to hear if you have and what you liked about it. We were on Manitoba Key and visited Gasparilla Island, full of beautiful shells on the beach, and also Venice, Florida. That day in Venice started out cloudy and the ocean water was a perfect sage green. Well, maybe that's where we get sea green from. It was very pretty. I have a number of photos and videos of the waves that are still waiting to be painted. Now it's time to start adding in the colors for the foreground dock. I'm using a combination of burnt sienna and raw umber. I wasn't satisfied with the value of the water in the lower part of the painting, so I've gone back and added an additional color with Dioxazine violet, Cobalt Blue, and a little bit of gray. I've deepened the shadow on the foreground dock, and I'm adding in the slats of the boards on the dock. Now I'm removing the masking tape from the mass. I'm using a flat brush and putting in the shadows on the mass. For the shadow color, I'm using a combination of Cobalt Blue and burnt sienna. The flat brush is also handy for cutting around the posts. Here you see that I'm darkening the foliage even more, and I think this really helps with the depth. While we're watching these details being painted, I want to talk about the drawing. I drew this by hand. Now, other options would be to trace the image or project the image onto paper taped to the wall. In fact, I remember hanging my watercolor paper on the wall, then setting up the projector on a small table, hoping that it would be the right height, and then projecting the photo onto the wall. For me, it was helpful, and I could get a very large image. Many of my paintings were full sheets. I made the room as dark as I could get, which meant I had to do the projecting and tracing after dark. But still, I found the projected image dim, and that made knowing exactly where to draw the line still difficult. However, there are still many artists today who project their images. If you're going to do a large painting, it's probably the best way to do it. The other challenge I found with projecting images onto the paper on the wall was that it was physically difficult, physically painful. It made my muscles ache. So I've moved away from using the projector. Today, if I want to do a large painting, I convert the image to a sketch on my iPad and then have it printed out on large paper. This is again the area that I was concerned about, where there was lots of equipment, but I really didn't want to get caught up in that. It takes too much attention from the boat, so I've made that area fairly dark. It's almost a 10 on the value scale. As you can see, we can get very dark with watercolor. Gone are the days when watercolors were very light, almost pastel colors. We can get a lot of depth with watercolor. The pigments are very intense now. You have choices on your approach. Do you want to work with deep values from the beginning of the painting process, or layer from light to dark, either wet and wet or letting the paper dry in between? In this case, mostly I'm letting the paper dry in between and using layering. It's helpful because it allows me to make decisions along the way without getting too dark too fast. So getting back to tracing, there's the whole controversy about tracing to begin with. I know there are artists who enter paintings into contests where they've traced the image onto the paper, and some people think that's cheating. I'm not so sure about that. I think it depends on your priorities and how much time in life you have to do this. And if you have any qualms about tracing, I would say reserve tracing for doing a commission, because that's where, if you're trying to be realistic, tracing can really help you out. Now for me, another downside of tracing was that I had become very dependent upon it. And so my drafting skills weren't growing. When I realized that, I decided I would only trace when necessary, and that I needed to freehand draw so I could improve my drawing skills. Well, still working that dock. That foreground dock didn't go well for me. Maybe you think it's okay, but I think there were some problems with the perspective. Maybe you can see what I did wrong. This painting, in fact, is a redo of one that I had done some years ago, and I got the perspective right then. I don't know what was happening here, and you can see I painted over it because I wasn't happy with how it turned out. If you want to see the original, it's on my website, and that address is listed in the description. This last trick is I'm using a gel pen for the lines between the boats on the docks. One of the things that a lot of watercolor artists do when they're finishing up a painting to get those final highlights is they'll go back with white gouache. Since then, I've discovered Dr. P.H. Martin's bleed-proof white, which is like the deepest, darkest gouache you can get. You don't have to go over and over and over like you do with gouache, which left me a little frustrated. I've got 3 tubes of white gouache, and they're all going to be unused. And that's another trick that I like to use to really get those highlights. And you'll see that in a little while when I paint in a little boat. For now, I'm using this gel pen, and you can actually paint over it if you need to, if it doesn't go the way you want to. I don't think I have footage on the little boat, but you'll see it in the final painting. And I've also used the Dr. P.H. Martin's bleed-proof white in other videos like the Mountains and Sea with the boat video. It's pretty handy stuff. Here's a completed painting. Let me know in the comments what you think of it compared to the original photo. To me, it's very cheerful and depicts the wonderful feeling I had with my family that afternoon at a tiki bar having drinks and dinner. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next one.